I have known Lord Cavan Aldenver for 31 years, and in all that time I have seen him moved by precisely three things: a well-reasoned argument, a horse of exceptional breeding, and though he would have denied it with some heat, his grandmother. The Dowager Duchess of Aldenver was 81 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and the most determined woman in the county. When she wrote to inform me in late March that she intended to resolve her grandson's marital impasse by the end of the fortnight, I assumed she was speaking fancifully. I had heard her say so before. 3 seasons of refusals had not dampened her, they had merely sharpened her aim. "I have found the right one, Dorian," she told me, over tea in the East drawing-room the morning I arrived at Aldenver Hall. "She is coming on Wednesday." "Does Cavan know?" I asked. "Cavan," she said, with the serenity of a woman who has outwitted more formidable opponents than her own grandson, "knows only that I have engaged a cataloguer for the late Duke's private library. Which is true. The library does need cataloguing. I see no contradiction." I did not argue. I poured myself a second cup of tea and settled in to watch. She arrived on a gray Wednesday morning, her traveling bag considerably smaller than fashion would have suggested, and her manner considerably steadier than most young women manage when deposited in the entrance hall of one of the larger estates in the south of England. Miss Calla Fenwick was the daughter of the village schoolmaster at Fenmore, a quiet market town some 20 miles distant, and she moved through the marble entrance hall of Aldenver as though she had catalogued ducal libraries every week of her adult life, which, I would later learn, she nearly had. Her father had raised her on books. She had spent 3 years assisting the librarian at Harcastle House before that family's removal to the continent, and she came with a letter of recommendation that the Dowager Duchess had, of course, solicited herself, though she took care not to mention this to Cavan. He met her in the entrance hall for exactly 4 minutes. I was there. He shook her hand, thanked her for making the journey, informed her that Mr. Aldrath, the head steward, would show her to the library and arrange whatever she required, and then excused himself to return to the estate accounts he had been reviewing since 7 that morning. He did not, as far as I could observe, look at her twice. The Dowager Duchess watched him go, then she looked at me. 4 minutes, I said. "He'll come round," she said. The library at Aldenver was a long, cold room on the north side of the house, and Calla Fenwick turned it, within 2 days, into something that resembled industry. She had a system. She had explained it to the steward in terms that made him blink, and by Thursday morning there were 3 long tables organized by subject and period, a running ledger in her clean, small hand, and a series of paper slips tucked into the volumes with notes I found, when I glanced at one, to be considerably more interesting than their modest appearance suggested. She had opinions. She had recorded them. The late Duke's collection of continental correspondence was, in her assessment, exceptional and criminally disordered, and the English poetry section had been shelved by size rather than any discernible principle, which explains a great deal about the 5th Duke's character. I showed this particular slip to the Dowager Duchess, who read it and laughed for the first time in what I suspected was weeks. Cavan found his way to the library on Thursday afternoon. I happened to be there, consulting a legal text I had borrowed from the late Duke's collection, when he came in. He stopped just inside the door, whether because he was surprised to find the room so thoroughly reorganized, or because Calla was standing on the library ladder reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, I could not say with certainty. He stood there for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was necessary. "Is it going well?" he asked. She came down the ladder with the book under her arm and looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had not yet learned to find him intimidating. "Very well, thank you. Your grandfather had a remarkable instinct for acquiring things and no instinct at all for keeping them in order. I expect to be done by Sunday." "Sunday?" he repeated. "If the weather holds and the steward can find me the second key to the locked case in the east alcove. One of the volumes in there is a first edition that your grandfather's catalogue has listed in the wrong decade. I'd like to correct it before I go." He looked at her for another moment. "I'll find you the key," he said. He found it himself that same evening, and brought it to the library rather than sending it with the steward. I know this because I saw him cross the east corridor with it in his hand, and the look of a man who has just made a decision he has not fully examined. Friday was the day the weather broke, and the rain that came down across Aldenver kept everyone indoors. I played chess with the Dowager Duchess in the morning and lost twice, which was customary, and in the afternoon I found myself passing the library door just as Cavan was emerging from it with a book in his hand, and a look on his face that I had not seen before, not irritation, which was his usual expression when something had interrupted the estate accounts, and not the polished, neutral courtesy he extended to guests. Something quieter, something that sat closer to the surface than he would have liked. "She found an error in my grandfather's personal correspondence index," he said when he noticed me. "Did she?" "3 errors." She left a note. He held up a small piece of paper folded once. His handwriting was not on it. She did not wish to interrupt me. "Considerate of her," I said. He looked at the paper again. "She's been here 4 days," he said, "and she has organized more of that library than Aldrath's last 2 hired catalogers managed in a combined 8 months. I said nothing. I was learning from the Dowager Duchess. Saturday brought the walled kitchen garden, which was Cavan's habit in the early morning. He walked it when he wanted to think, which was a piece of information the Dowager Duchess had passed to Calla in what she later described to me as a piece of general conversation about the estate. I cannot confirm the innocence of this characterization. What I can confirm is that Calla was in the walled garden on Saturday morning, having risen early to take some air before the day's work, and that Cavan walked in at 7:30 to find her standing at the far end by the espaliered pear trees, her face turned up toward the pale spring sky with an expression of such unguarded peace that he stopped walking. I was not there. He told me this later, much later, when he had stopped being ashamed of having noticed it. He said she did not hear him come in, and he stood for a moment, just a moment, before he announced himself. And then they walked the length of the garden together, talking about nothing of consequence, which is the conversation that contains everything. Sunday arrived, and with it the completion of the catalogue. I came down to breakfast to find the Dowager Duchess already at the table, which was unusual. She rarely appeared before 9, and already informed, which was not unusual at all. Calla had finished. She had left the completed catalogue on Cavan's desk, with the corrected index appended and the locked case properly documented, and she had arranged for the village carrier to collect her bag at 6 that morning, intending to take the early coach from the inn at Fenmore Cross rather than trouble the household for a carriage. She had not said goodbye. The Dowager Duchess was eating toast with perfect equanimity. "He'll notice by 8, she said when she saw me. Cavan came to breakfast at 7:30. He sat down, he poured his coffee, he looked at his correspondence, and then, after approximately 90 seconds of silence, he put down his cup and said, "Where is Miss Fenwick?" "Gone," the Dowager Duchess said, without looking up from her own correspondence. He was still for a moment. "Gone. She finished the catalogue last evening. She left very early to catch the Fenmore Cross coach." The Dowager Duchess turned a page. "I believe it departs at 8:30. I watched him. He was doing what he always did when something had surprised him, the very slight stillness, the careful arrangement of his expression, and I watched him arrive, across 15 seconds of silence, at something he could not arrange away. He set his napkin down. He pushed back his chair. He said, with a precision that was doing a great deal of work, "I have not thanked her adequately for the catalogue." "No," his grandmother agreed, "you have not." He was out of the room before she finished the sentence. I heard him in the hall, a word to the groom, brief, clipped, certain, and then the sound of a horse being brought round. The Dowager Duchess looked up from her correspondence for the first time that morning and regarded me across the breakfast table with the satisfaction of a woman whose calculations have come out exactly as she intended. 4 minutes, I said, in echo of myself from 5 days prior. 4 days, she corrected, and returned to her letters. I rode after him, at a somewhat more leisurely pace, because I wanted to see it, and because I was fairly sure he would need a witness. He reached the coaching inn at Fenmore Cross with 7 minutes to spare. The Aldenver groom had hitched the coach already, and the horses were stamping in the cold morning air, and Calla Fenwick was standing in the yard with her bag at her feet, pulling on her gloves, when Cavan Aldenver rode in through the gate. She looked up. She did not look surprised precisely. She had, I think, a better grasp of the situation than she had been letting on, but she did stop pulling on the second glove. She waited. He dismounted. He was not a man given to dramatic speeches. The estate of Aldenver had been run for 3 generations on the principle that a thing said clearly, and once was more reliable than a thing said at length, and he had absorbed this principle thoroughly. He stood in the inn yard, in front of the groom and the innkeeper and the 2 other passengers peering from the coach window, and he said, "The catalogue is extraordinary. I knew within the first hour of reading it that I would need to ask you several questions about the methodology, and I had intended to ask them this morning." He paused. "That was not the only thing I intended." Calla looked at him. "What else?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not uncertainty but precision, the space a man takes when he wants to be sure he says it correctly. "You walked my garden on Saturday morning," he said, "and you spoke to me about the pear trees and the spring coming in, and whether the late Duke had ever cared for the kitchen garden or only for the appearance of having one, and you had opinions about all of it." The faintest trace of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but near one. "You have opinions about everything, Miss Fenwick. I find I am not ready to stop hearing them." The groom had gone very still. The innkeeper had retreated a careful 3 steps. The 2 passengers in the coach were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. Calla picked up the second glove from where she had let it drop and held it, not putting it on. "I was engaged to catalogue a library," she said. "The work is done." "Yes," he said. "I would like to engage you in something else." A beat of silence. "The library will need tending," he said, "quarterly at the least, if it is to stay in the order you have given it. And the kitchen garden, I find, has needed someone to have opinions about it for considerably longer than I realized." He did not move toward her. He was, I understood, leaving the ground between them entirely in her hands. "I am not asking you to catalogue anything, Miss Fenwick. I am asking you to come back, not as an employee of the household, but as someone I would very much like to have a reason to see at breakfast." The spring morning was cold and quiet. Somewhere up the lane a thrush was doing its best. Calla looked at him for a long moment, the steady, unhurried look of a woman who has learned not to accept what is not sincerely meant and knows, now, the difference. Then she put the glove in her bag, picked up her traveling case, and held it out to him. He took it. They rode back to Aldenver together, her on the groom's horse and he beside her, and they were talking before they reached the first turn in the road about the methodology of the catalogue and the pear trees, and whether the kitchen garden might bear strawberries if given half a chance. I let them go ahead. I sat on my horse at the gate of the Fenmore Cross coaching inn and watched them diminish down the pale spring road, and I thought of a 4'11" woman drinking tea in the east drawing-room, serene as a general who has never doubted the outcome of the battle. They married in June at the Aldenver Estate Chapel, and it was the quietest and the warmest wedding I have ever attended. The Dowager Duchess wore her best silk and said nothing, which was the loudest thing she could have said. Cavan thanked her, the morning after the wedding, for the introduction. "I only had the library catalogued," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You did rather more than that." She smiled and poured her tea and said, "I know."